let's get some analysis on this. We're now joined via Zoom by the political analyst, Professor Dirk Kotze. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, since the local government elections of 2021, the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro has now had 3 mayors after, Johnson and Odendaal. What kind of leadership do you anticipate in Van Niekerk, and will the Metro finally see some form of stability, do you think?
I think that the big problem about the Nelson Mandela Bay is the fact that both the ANC and the DA received exactly the same number of seats in the 2021 election. So it means that both of them can form coalitions, and it is actually a contest amongst them how many of the other parties they can attract in order to establish such a coalition. And that in itself constitutes a lot of the uncertainty or instability that we've seen there. At the moment now, it is again primarily the ANC group that has taken over. And as they've done in the Gauteng metros, they've now given it to one of the small parties to take the lead there. Northern Alliance is mainly in the northern areas of Nelson Mandela Metro, but they are not one of the really big players in the metro itself. So I think this is going to be another test of for how long they can exist in this formation, and to what extent there will be some defections, because that is what happened each time, is that there's some of the smaller parties defect to the other side, and that leads them to the switch. I think what one has to take into account that the stability or the service delivery in metros all over the country, as well as other local authorities, don't depend specifically on who's the governing formation at a particular point in time. It does in terms of policy matters, and does in terms of that there must be a proper budget, but the real work is being done by the officials, by the administration. So it is this coexistence between the executive, the mayor and the mayoral committee, and those in council, as well as the officials and the administration, that must work smoothly in order to have a well-functioning metro.
And I want us to touch on that. You've mentioned, of course, that the ANC-EFF collision, we've seen them, going into partnership. We've seen it before with the other metros, including Mogale City. And you've just mentioned something very interesting now in them electing then the smaller parties and making one of them, become the mayor. And we know now that, the ANC through the NEC has prioritized coalitions high up on its agenda. So talk to us about the strategy here. Where is it going, and what is at stake?
I think what we are starting to see is that the coalescence between the ANC and the EFF, and this is what we see now at Nelson Mandela Bay also, I think this lies at the core of these changes that are happening. But because the ANC and the EFF cannot agree about who should be amongst the two of them, should take the leading position of mayor and that of speaker, they normally choose now one of the smaller parties. That, as you say, is the case in Johannesburg, first of all, in Mogale City, and in Ekurhuleni also. And many people will say it is actually the EFF that's the one who's like the kingmaker in this situation, and that they force the ANC to take up this position of not filling it with one of their own members, in order to be able to prevent it from being seen that the EFF is actually the number 2 party, or is actually dependent on what the ANC is determining, and that they provide the leadership in these councils. Now that means that the focus is in the first instance on the 2 main political parties in this case now, and not so much on the way in which the coalition is actually structured, because that's almost subsumed and below the surface, instead of what we are really seeing unfolding when there's, for example, an election of a mayor. I think this is the unfortunate situation. Keep in mind that the ANC has said with its rules that were announced by the National Executive Committee of the ANC, that the leading party, the party with the most seats, must take the lead in the formation of coalition governments. And that's at the moment not taking place. It is this alternative, almost shadow, that's being established in order to keep the coalition together between the ANC and the EFF. And that's, I think, I would say, is one of the key explanations why there's still so much uncertainty and fluidity within these different coalitions.
One of the things that we are seeing with these coalition governments is, again, parties increasingly talking about what is in it for them in order to lead. What we are not hearing from these political parties is what happens to service delivery. We hear it obviously when one party loses over another, like in this case, the DA saying that they don't think this new coalition will prioritize service delivery. What is at stake for the people, particularly in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro?
Well, Nelson Mandela Bay has a very unfortunate history. In terms of service delivery, there was now this drought for very long. It looks like there's now some relief in that respect. But it has become a ball between the different political parties, and caught in between them are the different communities, the residents of these areas, or the metro in general. And that is what we have seen is that there's so much intense competition, and we all have to remind ourselves all the time, in about a year's time, there's going to be the national and provincial elections. So that is on top of all of this competition, is now this positioning, this posturing that is taking place by the different parties to put them in the most favorable position for next year's election. So that means, and I think that justifies why there's now a convergence of views amongst the ANC on the one hand and the DA on the other hand, of saying we have to start to formalize the way in which these coalitions should function. And we've seen, for example, from the DA side already private legislation in Parliament. The ANC has announced their principles. SALGA has got a document that they compiled together with the Dalla Umar Institute in order to set out some general guidelines and almost rules about how coalition should function. So I think that is starting to emerge, and that it is just not an open-ended situation where any party can join a coalition and everyone will be eligible to be in the most senior positions.
Prof, thank you so much for your analysis. One obviously wonders what this new regulatory framework that COGTA wants to introduce will look like, ahead of the 2024 elections. But let's leave our conversation here for now. I appreciate your time and your analysis, Professor Dirk Kotze there.